Welcome to the Laughing Frog Pottery School. I'm just going to do a few posts, videos, which go through the basics of wheel throwing. As anyone who's tried to make pots and not got very far knows, the hardest and first thing you have to do is to get the clay centered. Centering provides two functions. The first is to get the clay evenly distributed around the wheel head. The second is to, in a sense, continue the kneading process so that you're getting the feel of how the clay is inside the ball, whether there's rough bits or uneven bits, stuff like that. So the centering has these two sort of distinct functions. My process of centering for a ball of about this size, which is roughly 500 grams, is to have my right arm fixed and leaning in. It's not important that it be your right arm, but in my case, because I'm using a kick wheel, my left leg's moving a lot, so I can't really brace my right arm, my left arm as well as I can my right arm. So my right arm's fixed and pushing in, locked into my knee or on the wheel head, trying to provide a firm push with that section of my hand towards the centre of the clay. With my left hand, I bring it on the outside, so my fingers are on the outside of my right hand, and I'm going to use this section of my left hand, kept vertical to bring in, squeezing inwards, allowing the clay to move upwards. I'm not really lifting my hands up very much, the clay is just moving up by itself. And then I'm going to lift the thin eye of my left hand and use that, pushing from the centre to the edge of the ball of clay. So the pressure at this stage is coming over that section there, and I'm creating a slightly domed piece of clay. So the way I see centering is that what I'm trying to do is to provide a profile around this ball of clay at one time, which will force the clay to go on centre. So it leaves the clay no other option. The way I do it is I've got the first position here with my right hand and my left hand pushing downwards there. So it's essentially on the downward movement that I think that the centering is accomplished. If I've got providing this profile from two hands, it's really important that my hands are locked together and not able to operate as two separate units. And so that's why the grip at the back is really important. The coning up action enables me to in a sense, as a continuation of the kneading process that's gone before the ball of clay was brought to the wheel. The important thing to remember is that whenever you're applying pressure, you're actually distorting the clay. So although that feels on centre now, if I take my hand away quickly, you can see that that's off centre because of that pressure. And as a sort of a more graphic demonstration of that, if I've got that as a cone and I provide pressure like that, take my hand away quickly, it's off. You can see that it's off centre. If I bring my hand back slowly, you can see that it comes onto centre. So you've got to remember that whenever you're applying pressure, you're distorting the clay, and so you've got to release that clay gently. If you're on an electric wheel and the speed's much faster, then you can release the pressure faster. It's sort of dependent on the speed with which the clay's travelling around on the wheel. On the kick wheel, I don't go at a very high speed. I'm going to do another video that'll be specifically about centering, but for the purposes of this, that I think is probably going to be enough. So to open up, I support my right hand with my left hand, bringing it down in the centre, so it's this longer finger on the centre. And as I'm pushing downwards, I'm pushing in an open, gentle V, rather than as a steep hollow. And part of the reason I do that is by pushing downwards with my hand at a position like that, I'm spreading the pressure over a wider area, which means that the clay is being trapped between my hand and the wheel head, and it's aligning the clay particles in a way that is less likely to allow S-cracking to occur. When I've got to the bottom, so my left hand is really just supporting my right hand. It's not really holding the clay. I don't want to develop a thin edge on this clay there. When I've got to the bottom, and if you're sort of running, if you're afraid of going too far, don't be afraid to use a needle tool to test your bottom. Once I've got there, I just draw that clay back to the diameter that I want the interior of the base to be. I clean up the base by just putting my thumb in the centre, bracing it with my left hand and pushing it across to 9 o'clock, if you think of it as a clock face. Now I've got a shallow, sort of like a donut of clay, and as a continuation of the centering process, I want to be able to recenter this at this stage. That's pretty much on centre at the moment, so just to make it less on centre, I'll just take a scoop out of it. Being on centre means that you've got an even distribution of clay around the wheel head. Around the centre of the wheel head. And so by cutting that away, I've now definitely made that off centre. What I'm going to do is put my thumb of my left hand down against the wheel head, bring my index finger of my left hand so that it's just touching the top of that clay, but it's supporting the wall. And I use a sponge over the rim at this time. And what I'm aiming to do with that sponge is to stretch it between my index finger, which is on the horizontal, and this section of my second finger, which is on the vertical of it, so that my hand's actually coming like that over the clay, but with a sponge stretched over that and held by my thumb. On a larger piece of clay, I can just use my hand like that to achieve the same purpose, but on a small piece of clay, my hand's a bit too big, so the sponge enables me to curve that over that section. So now I'm leaning downwards with that sponge. Again, I'm providing a profile over the whole cross-section of the clay, and that's meaning that the clay's got nowhere to go but to be on centre. So you can, it's a really handy little trick to develop, because it means that your initial centering is less critical, and you can open it up and then make sure it's centered at this point. There's a third centering process that I'll show you in a little while, where I'm centering a thrown cylinder. So because I'm in this position, my thumb's against the wheel head, my index finger's there, the sponge resting on the rim. If I just push upwards with this thumb, upwards and inwards towards an imaginary point in the centre of the axis of the wheel head, the centre of the wheel head, the clay should flow upwards without much effort. As you'll see in a later video, this process works really well when you try to throw bowls, because you can have the majority of the bowl thrown almost effortlessly. So, we come to the basic process of throwing. When I'm throwing, I'm going to use this section of my fingers here, facing my right hand on the outside, and it's essentially that section of my right hand that's doing the work. So, with my right hand, what I do is I gently bring in the bottom 3 fingers, and then drop my thumb onto that. So it's not tightly clenched, it's got to be fairly relaxed. My thumb's resting on top, and I like to say that the thumb's in line with the bones of my arm. Then I bring my index finger in to touch there. And that gives me a section like that, which I'll bring in horizontally against the pot. My left hand is on the inside. What I encourage people to do is to keep your elbow up quite high, because what that enables your left hand to do, your wrist can then turn so that your fingertips are facing the hand there. If your elbow's down low, then you're more likely to use the side of your fingers, which I think is less satisfactory. So your hand coming like that. And one thing that for throwing a cylinder, I would always encourage the fingertip on the inside to be a fraction above this section there, so that you're pushing into that. When you watch someone throwing, you'll see this bulge moving up the pot, and that's because their hand the clay's being stretched and thinned over the fingertips, and then lifted up and consolidated by the knuckle as it's moving up the clay. So there's other ways of throwing. Some people use their fingertips like this. I can't do that, so I won't show you. So my left hand is on the inside, my hand is on the outside like that, and I'm hooking the thumb across the back to give me a good contact between them so that they can move at the same speed. Now, I said before I'll show you how to centre a third way of centering. If I again cut the top of this to give me an uneven section, then if I bring this right hand over the top like that, my left hand supports. So what I'm trying to do is bring the clay right up into the web of my fingers there. My left hand is around supporting the pot, and I'm applying a slight downward pressure. In doing that, the clay again has got nowhere to go, and so it's going to end up coming on centre. The pot's got to be tall enough that I can get my fingers into it, but I have them slightly curved so that they're following around the curve. As you can see, that's brought that back on centre. And I find it a really good way to control the rim of a pot during the throwing process. I notice some people just come down and hit it like this, which just gives you a square surface. If I, instead of doing that, do this, it just draws the clay back on centre that little bit more, and it gives you the confidence to use this at a later time as a collaring in technique to make bottles and other forms that have necks. So again, my left hand on the inside, this process using my right hand with the clay right up to the web of my fingers works really well, but you've got to be a bit cautious once the pot becomes quite thin, because you have to put a little bit of downward pressure and the pot's more likely to collapse at that stage. I like a bit of information left on the surface of the pot by the passing of the hands. I don't like very strong throwing rings, but equally I don't like the form sort of work smooth with a tool. But that's just an aesthetic thing, and it depends on what sort of process you're trying to do. So I use these tools quite a lot to trim away the clay at the bottom. They're real. I started using them for cleaning up when I was throwing bottles, because I hate turning bottles, and with this I can remove enough clay that the bottle doesn't actually need turning. But with this I can bring it in at the bottom and trim that away. And it has the advantage that it removes the slip that's down on the bottom of the pot in this section here, and so it makes it easier to lift the pot off the wheel in the end. And if you notice on my wheel, I've got these little scrapers built there, which I can just scrape my hands like that. And it's essentially this section of my hand that is important, because the strength of the pot is down there where the clay is on the base of the wheel. And by stretching the clay, by scraping my hand there, I'm removing the slip, and the clay will stick to my hands, and so I can just lift the pot up and take it off. Now I'm going to repeat that, doing it in one action rather than talking quite so much. So centering, not lifting my hands, but squeezing this section of my hand in so the clay is forced up, then lifting the thinner, which is that section there, up across the top and pushing downwards. If I lift my hands when I'm throwing, I'm more inclined to develop a hollow in the centre as the outside surface of clay gets lifted up. There's all different ways of people centering, you'll see them all on YouTube, but this sort of works for me. I change the way depending on the size of the ball of clay, so I'll centre differently with a small piece of clay or with a really large piece of clay, but for your normal average sized ball of clay this works quite well. So then I'm going to push downwards with my fingertip. The left hand's actually giving me the sense of the depth. It's the relationship between my fingertip and my left hand that helps me to judge the base, rather than it providing a pressure against the clay. And so I'll draw back with almost no pressure on the outside, just letting the clay come back out. Thumb into the centre, push it across to 9 o'clock so it cleans up the base. Left hand coming down on the outside, so the thumb's almost horizontal, index finger coming onto the inside of the surface. Sponge stretched between those fingers like that. So what I do, the way I think about it is I've got my fingers like that, I bend the second one at this knuckle, and that provides the basic position. Press downwards to centre it, and then just start pushing upwards with the thumb. The sponge resting on the rim means that if it gets a little bit dry, I can just squeeze that sponge, and it provides a little bit more water. I usually use a sponge to apply water rather than that, because by the time I do that, most of the water's fallen off. And then left hand on the inside. My right hand so that I'm bringing those 3 fingers in loosely at the bottom, dropping my thumb there, and then touching that with my index finger, and that's the kind of position that I want. elbow up quite high, thumb of my left hand onto my wrist to make one unit out of both those two hands. So the pressure starts down there. As I get to the rim, I even it off a little bit more. You can see that bulge where my fingertips pushing the clay out. Bring my right hand over to consolidate the rim. Trimming the clay away with the tool. There we go.